I'm Tim Ventura, and we're joined today by Bronwyn Williams, an economist, trend analyst, futurist, consultant, and author. Bronwyn is the Foresight lead and trend analyst at Flux Trends, the author of The Future Starts Now, published by Bloomsbury Business, and an accomplished strategist and speaker with experience discussing a variety of intersectional business, technology, and social trends. She has a master's in applied economics from the University of Bath, Post-Grad Diploma in Future Studies from Stellenbosch Business School, Foresight and Futurism Studies at the University of Manchester, in addition to economic and fintech degrees from the London School of Economics and Political Science, University of Oxford, and University of Johannesburg. So Bronwyn, welcome back. Today, we are talking about the rise of the SHEconomy, a Morgan Stanley report from late 2019 that predicted that 45% of women aged 25 to 44 will be single by the year 2030. So what were your initial thoughts when you read this?
Well, first of all, it's not a huge surprise. I mean, this has been a long tending curve across the so-called sort of weird Western world. As women got more educated after the sexual revolution of the 60s and 70s, women started to get married later or not at all. And relationships shifted from being quite monogamous and happening once in your life, you got your happily ever after, towards much more fluid relationships and hookup culture, which is what we've kind of arrived at right now. So on the one hand, there's sort of more choice, so less incentive to settle down. On the other hand, there's also huge economic incentives not to settle down at all, particularly for women, and particularly when it comes to owning potential. So like one of the famous economist articles from a good few years ago now showed that actually in most of the developed world, talking now about the Americas, North Americas, and Europe, at least Western Europe, that the wage gap between men and women had actually disappeared, in fact, even reversed. But there's a caveat there. That's only for women who do not have children. So if you do have children, in other words, you have that relationship, either a child of your own or a romantic partner that could be a risk of becoming a parent, there's an economic disadvantage to that. So in terms of incentives, women are incentivized to stay single and to stay, if not celibate, at least childless, from a purely economic point of view. And that's really been the message that women have been given since the sexual revolution, since the 60s and 70s, where it was all about you can get a job, you can have an economic career, you do not have to rely on a man for your economic fortune. You should go out there and secure your economic independence. And that's exactly what the last couple of generations of women have done. And they've done it quite well, with a few caveats, which we can get into if you want to get into sort of the details within that data. But the side effect of that is physical, if not mental or psychological loneliness. It means not having children, not having those biological needs met. It also means not having the emotional security of a long-term partner. Again, huge amounts of sort of possible pros and cons there. A lot of women from previous generations were stuck in relationships that didn't give them any fulfillment in terms of loneliness. If you obviously married to the wrong person and it's quite hard to get out of, that's obviously a negative factor for that. But the truth is that most of us do have some sort of desire for human connection, and that having neither a romantic partner nor a child as you're nearing midlife can result in a bit of a sense of crises. I think that one of the most interesting examples there, I know I'm going on quite a lot here, would be the case of Jennifer Aniston, who's a celebrity. So we all like to talk about her because she's basically grown up and had her whole life within the spotlight. And she quite famously in the past has said that she didn't want children. She had no desire to have children. More recently, she's come out in the press saying that now she doesn't, and she would very much like that. But she's obviously struggled with infertility and all these sorts of things. So I find it interesting from a sort of trend analyst signal collecting perspective that a lot of the stories that we told younger versions of ourselves, or we told the public, or we told younger generations, weren't quite the full story. So anyway, lots of pros and cons to get into there, but maybe that's the interesting way to start framing this conversation.
That's wonderful. And, as I was researching the questions for this, on the surface, this definitely is about empowerment and changing culture. You've also got some themes from demographic transition. There are a lot of undercurrents, though, that were really interesting. And as I started to do research on this, I was like, there's a lot going on behind the scenes. So let me jump into the Morgan Stanley report, which says, quote unquote, more women are delaying marriage, delaying childbirth, or having fewer children. And they frame this as a positive trend to put upward pressure on women's wages and help increase overall consumer spending. So again, the Morgan Stanley report is saying that women want to achieve more and they want to achieve career parity with men. I guess that's kind of on the surface that's how this story was presented.
Yeah, even the titles, the SHEconomy, it's very empowering. It's very girl bossy. It's very, yay, look at us go.
Yeah. Well, so there was another story that was based on this by author Ariana E. on Medium, and she was blogging from the perspective of gender stereotypes and equality. And again, this was very pro girl bossy, but she did discuss some of these larger themes that you mentioned about with loneliness and about, issues with the family and things like that. And she suggested that women are pressured to marry later due to changing social norms that are stressing, again, female empowerment and independence. Her perspective was that women are keeping up with the Joneses and working to fulfill social expectations for independence. So this might go to what you were saying about Jennifer Aniston, where women could potentially feel pressured to a societal norm, but they may also feel lacking, I guess, for some of the, the family connections that they might otherwise have.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting way to frame it, is particularly around the whole feminism question. There's quite a big difference between the right to do things, no matter what your gender is, and then the obligation to do so. Yeah. And that's really the switch that's happened really within my generation. So when I was growing up, like my mom, moms in the 80s and the 70s had the choice, right? You could divorce your husband, you could go get a career, you could also be a stay-at-home mom. And the economics and the social norms supported either path and either choice. Now, this was an improvement from the sort of 50s and before, or basically, actually, that's not even fair. It's the pre-World War kind of Western woman who didn't have a career, who was kept by her hopefully rich husband. It sucked, of course, if you were poor, but if you were wealthy, that deal was sort of okay if you didn't mind not actually having a career. If you wanted a career, you'd have to go and get your nails done and be an assistant in someone's office. That was sort of the stereotype there. The World Wars kind of shifted that. Obviously, women went to work in many of the major Western powers, and that sort of became normalized. These were all sort of lead ups towards that whole big 1970s kind of sexual revolution. But the point is that in theory, at least, the sort of silent generation, what would be now sort of grandparents or great grandparents, really older women, wouldn't have had the choice to have a career. And if they were allowed to work or offered a job, it would be quite a menial job in like a secretarial role, quite a demeaning position compared to the sort of hierarchy of power within the office. So they didn't have the choice really to be a career woman. It was very difficult to be single and to be independent. In fact, it was an economic disaster to be a spinster. You were never going to compete with a home that had a male breadwinner. So you didn't have a choice then. Then the sort of sexual revolution generation, the boomer generation, which in many ways was quite a fortunate generation, growing up in a world that was booming in more senses than one, had the choice, or they fought for the choice. That was the whole point of the sort of 60s and 70s social revolutions, where women wanted the choice. They wanted the right to work in careers alongside men, the right to have the same opportunities in those workplaces. And we have been successful in that. But at the same time, when you do now have actually twice as many people competing for jobs across our economies that aren't necessarily growing at quite the same rate, suddenly in order to be a stay-at-home wife, if that was your choice, or to be even just a single woman now, you had to work twice as hard, right? Because a single earning home simply cannot compete with a dual income home. So suddenly, if you wanted to maintain your socioeconomic standards as a family, you needed a double income home, right? And now we've got to the point where the right to work sort of becomes the obligation to work. Now, as a woman, you have to have a career, whether you're a single woman or a married, partnered woman. If you want to keep up with the socioeconomic sort of inflation, the mimetic inflation of what everybody wants, is now sort of, you have to work. Unless you are a trust fund person, and those are, of course, the huge exceptions, which puts a lot of pressure onto women, which is why we see women are overeducated. I mean, there's a lot of interesting data there. As I said, the gender pay gap disappears if you look now at non-mothers, if you just look at men versus women actually out-earn men in developed parts of the world. There's a big disclaimer there. That's not taking place in Africa and parts of Asia where gender equality hasn't reached that point. But where there is gender equality from a constitutional sort of societal level, women are earning the same as men. And that's something that's often neglected in the press, that parenting then kind of becomes a choice. Not only that, women are out-educating men. So women are getting more degrees, they have higher levels of education than their male counterparts do, which is also really interesting. But at the same time, you still kind of have the sense of it's never quite going to be enough. And that's because everything else sort of inflates it around you. And those rights have switched into obligations, which makes us question a lot of the actual gains from an economic perspective and from a social perspective of selling everyone the same dream. Right. So, these are the challenges of the excesses of capitalism that people on the more sort of economic left rightly challenge. Right. I mean, this is sort of like growth at all costs economics, like is the only reason that our GDP is growing because we suddenly sort of tipped the other 50% of the working population, all the women, into the workplace. And what happens now? Now that we kind of don't have an additional unworked gender to sort of pour into the economy to continue those levels of inflated growth. So there's a sort of sense of being on a treadmill, and it's tricky, but I think it's no surprise that we're at this point right now where we do have women that are making economic rather than social choices, even if it's not what they really want. We have to kind of keep up on those sorts of games. But
yeah. And, if I could, I'm going to come to the statistics in just a second, but if I could highlight something you said, you were saying that rights become obligations. And one of the things that I tend to believe is that, every family, every relationship, every person is different. And so really what we want, especially for women, is to be able to maximize choice. You were talking about the 1980s, right? Where women had the choice. They could be a stay-at-home mom if they decided that was the best for their family, and themselves. They could also go into the workforce and, hopefully achieve parity with men for the same roles. That's, to me, that seems like the best possible outcome because it maximizes the choice for not just the woman, but the family unit as well. So.
Maximizing choice is something that I would definitely agree with. I think that's what we want to aim for if you want to sort of look at policy level choices and degrees or measure outcomes that are actually a success, right? Because we set these sort of measures that we say this will be successful. It will be successful when we achieve pay gap parity. And I'm telling you, we have when we take into account people's choices. If you look at the choices of people who have chosen to have families over prioritizing their careers, the gender pay gap looks like it's still there because all women put together don't earn as much as men, right? But if you look at women who have chosen fully committed to the world of work and the world of men, they are succeeding and over succeeding over there. At the same time, when you then look at the choices that other women have made to prioritize other things, we tend to think that that's a failure in terms of economic parity, but maybe that's actually a good thing. It shows that people have different values. That's actually great for society. It's great for economics too. This is how you can have win-win gains in like a capitalist society when I have different values to you and we can trade those values till we both end up with something more than what we want. And that's also something that I speak quite a lot about to women in the workplace, because quite often invited to get involved with organizational change and future of work conversations. And there's this sort of lie that we kind of told each other that came out of the 80s when, as you said, women had that choice. It was like you can have everything. This was a kind of a lie that was told to the entire millennial generation. You can have anything and you can become anyone you want to be. And it's not quite true because there's a whole lot of other people that kind of want those same things. The point is you can't have everything. You can't have both all of your biological familial needs met and have the perfect masculine type career. There are trade-offs. There's absolutely no way you can work like a crazy boss lady or a complete she-boss and also be a fully committed mother. A part-time mothering is very different to full-time mothering. And of course, full-time mothering isn't for everyone, but when it comes to having children, it's a very different. It's not, you can't have it both. You can kind of have but you can choose. And that's a much better message to tell people than this sort of lie that you really can have everything, because you absolutely cannot. No one can. That's the whole entirety of life is choices, right? And figuring out what your values are. But unfortunately, our society is so skewed towards capitalism, and so many of us are so ingrained in so many of us that your value is your bank balance, and that's what you should therefore value. That's why we end up in these patterns where people are pursuing goals that are not actually based on their true internal values. They're rather based on mimetic values of society at large. I think that does quite a lot of harm.
Well, let me jump into some of the stats here, because these are kind of the undercurrents that aren't immediately obvious. I was a little bit surprised, but according to Pew Research, inflation-adjusted prices, and this is U.S. data, for homes, cars, and college tuition has doubled since the 1970s. Medical costs are up 150%. Last year, inflation jumped 8%. So one of the ideas here could also be that women are waiting to start families because, at least in America, women simply can't afford the traditional family lifestyle in today's economy, right? And so one thing I'm wondering is, is the economy itself forcing women to choose between poverty and a family?
Well, this is the tragedy of a commons, right? This is something that we've had conversations with, and there are actually academic papers from the world of economics that kind of speaks to the sort of the dirty subtext, that what's actually going on. I mean, you said since the 1970s, what house prices have doubled, right? But then also the number of workers in the workforce has doubled over the same period, right? So actually, the price of a house has kind of stayed the same, right? It's just that now that income is kind of distributed across a greater proportion of the population. But the other sort of the sort of darker side of women entering the workforce is an inflationary divide, but also a greater divide between rich and poor. Because what we definitely seem to see, and you can see this on dating app data, if you want to download the Tinder dating sort of trend report they put out every quarter or every year or whatever it is, it'll back this data up, that people want to date and mate and match according to their own socioeconomic standard. So wealthier women and wealthier men will tend to date and mate and marry and breed with people who are also wealthy, which means that what happens when you're having both genders working in the workplace, what you end up is with not just double income homes, but you end up with double high income homes, and then you end up with double low income homes. So it kind of compounds the difference between wealthy and poor. And and of course, there are more poorer people, relatively speaking, than wealthy people, because that's kind of the sort of Pareto effects of our general economies. So women entering the workforce has not only increased to inflationary pressure, again, that right to becomes that obligation to just to sort of maintain living standards, because although we increased the labor supply, we doubled the labor supply effectively over quite a short period of time. We didn't double the production, of all goods. There's still like real scarcity underpinning a lot of these things. Yes, we did increase productivity, but not to the same doubling effect, right? So there are inflationary costs there, but there's also inequality costs there, in that it became the gap between wealthy and poor. When you compound it by, you multiply all of those factors by 2, it becomes a wider gap, right? Which means that poorer women and single women who perhaps before were able to compete with double income homes by a single lady, going and being that typist, taking that less than amazing job, or the Mad Men thing, like going and working, copywriting, hustling your way through, that exceptional single woman simply cannot compete with now a double income home. And this sort of touches on a whole lot of the luxury values conversations that have been had. I don't know if you follow the work of Rob K. Henderson on Twitter. He's got a new book coming out. He's a great thinker in that whole idea of luxury values. In fact, he kind of coined the phrase there. And what he really got to there, which I think is critical to this conversation, is that it's a luxury value for people like the Wall Street Journal or McKinsey or anyone else to come out with wonderful papers talking about the she economy and single female empowerment, when the dirty little secret is that the wealthiest people in our society tend to be married in more stable relationships and have more children, right? So this is a disconnect between the values spouted and purported by the elites in our society and the values they live themselves. So I always like to say revealed preference is obviously far more telling than stated preference. And it's quite interesting that whole sort of she economy, that single, I'm going to be an independent woman, sort of whole mindset, it's still quite a middle class kind of a convention, right? Because your really wealthy people and the really elite strata of society globally does sort of settle down into monogamous child rearing sort of units, right? Which I think really, really fascinating to look at the difference between what is stated as being a value to aspire to and what is sold to and what the pressure is to become, and then what people who have achieved economic success have done. And again, there's very logical economic reasons for that too. As I said, that's the compounding effects of wealthy people marrying each other and having wealthy children, keeping that sort of money in the cycle. So when it comes to gender economics, there's just so much going on there, and so much of it is tied to classism and to inequality and to entrenched generational wealth.
Yeah. Let me touch on falling birth rates, because I think that this also falls into this entire discussion. The birth rate in the United States has fallen to 1.6 children per woman. 2.1 children is required to maintain a stable population. There are over 25 countries currently struggling with falling birth rates due to what's termed demographic transition. And this is a consequence of the trends that you're describing. So in the media, again, this is described as a positive solution to overpopulation, but viewed another way, I'm wondering if this could be what they call behavioral sink, like John Calhoun's famous mouse utopia experiment.
Yeah, that's true though. But in terms of the population decline, I think it's also important to know that people tend to think of it as being a developed world phenomena. It's absolutely not. There's like the latest data coming out that this is global, even within developing markets. And in fact, those birth rates are falling faster, not to lower levels, but at a faster rate, not to an absolute lower level, in developing parts of the world like my own, in Africa and throughout Asia. Even in South Africa, where I live, our birth rates, even prior to COVID, which saw a massive drop off in birth rates during the lockdown period, and since then, our birth rates were sitting at only like 2.2, which is, as you said, just on the cusp of replacement rate. It was far from this exponential growth. And I think that's really interesting that this conversation has only started to take place now. I mean, as a futurist and economist, like we've been banging on about like populations are not going to go exponential. In fact, we're going to see like perhaps by the year 2050 will be peak human in terms of number of people on the planet. So if you're kind of lucky kind of thing, or maybe at the end of the century, if you're like a bit, if you're like an extreme pessimist in terms of sort of population growth. But these things are not a surprise to people. Anyone's looked at the data, but it seems to be a surprise in popular consciousness because the conversation has been too many people, degrowth is the only way forward and all of these sorts of things. But there's another uncomfortable angle to that, in that perhaps there is a more cynical reason why these conversations around actual degrowing populations and degrowth as a sort of agenda and idea are kind of synchronizing right now, in that in economic terms, due to very deliberate economic policies that have taken place across the world, human populations in terms of human labor equals productivity. It falls into those economic equations, like you multiply your capital stock rate with your labor rates, and that's sort of that's where your production and your GDP growth come from. Those equations are fundamentally sort of breaking down now at an international level, where population growth rates or population stock, human resources, are increasingly being viewed by states, and by companies too, as liabilities and not as assets, which is something that I've been on about quite a lot. Very interesting to note that the whole sort of gender thing and females going into the workplace did mean that the per person productivity rate has declined since then. That's what I mentioned. Like you double the stock of labor, but you didn't double the productivity over the same sort of period. But that's become more and more of an extreme break away. Whereas we do see more and more people, for economic terms, and actually rational terms, as being economically dependent on, not independent of the state, which means that there are more and more people who are economic liabilities from an accounting, utilitarian, gross perspective. But these are conversations that we have. In fact, just this week, Yuval Harari, the Sapiens writer, came out with another one of his absolutely beautiful, like completely out of touch with the sort of the nuances of human beings and like how people's feelings, in other words, just completely not taking cognizance of the sensitivity of the problem. And he spoke about how the biggest challenge of the economic century ahead is going to be what to do with all the surplus people. Now, his term of surplus, he was talking about surplus as being economically a liability rather than an asset to nation states, due to the fact that more and more people's work can and will be done by technology or by better, smarter, faster people, for example. But he just sort of articulated something that's kind of been brewing behind the scenes for some time. But if you want any sort of tangible sort of examples of that, I think the most chilling and the most sort of obvious one of that would have to be Canada. And it's economic incentives to euthanasia for people, economic reasons, right? Like the government will say, we can't afford to pay for your healthcare, but would you like us to pay for your death instead? That's a very obvious sort of signal of that shift of how people are being viewed as liabilities. And I think that goes hand in hand with the population degrowth conversations, why perhaps this hasn't been a bigger policy issue, because many policymakers who perhaps don't understand human values as opposed to just economic values, and how so much value is based on irrational rather than utilitarian values, which is what Harari gets fully wrong about surplus people. There's no such thing as surplus people, because everything we want is irrational. Our whole economy is irrational. When you look at that, you can be quite comfortable, will be quite fine. But those sorts of conversations, because we want to avoid having those conversations, we kind of avoid having the conversations around population degrowth being so damaging to our future as a human species, right? It's because at some level we do view ourselves as liabilities and not as assets, which is very scary. So it's a bit challenging.
Well, and so I want to touch on children also. I am a single dad with full custody, and I'll tell you from experience, it is not easy. I've got groceries, cleaning, school and sports transportation, tutoring, teacher conferences, play dates, and much more. Now, single dads do typically have more income to work with, but single moms can wear makeup to hide the dark circles. So I think ultimately, we share a lot of the same challenges. I'm wondering if this trend towards single women who are marrying later, they're still, many of them, having children. Does this aggravate the situation in terms of, just stress, in terms of what it takes to have and raise a child, and then having to do that by yourself while you're working full time?
Oh, absolutely. Although there's a little bit of as an aside, there's some data that perhaps you'll enjoy hearing, and that is that when it comes to future life outcomes for children, the children of single moms versus the children of co-parent homes, this is the children of, as yourself, single dads, it turns out that children of single moms are at a socioeconomic disadvantage for the rest of their lives. But as long as there is a man present in the house, whether that man is a single dad or a cohabiting father figure, the children will have perfectly fine life outcomes. So your kids will be better off than the kids of a single mom. The reasons for that, I don't want to go into, I don't want to speculate on that. It's got more to do with the social aspect than the economic aspect there. And just in terms of having a reliable father figure around, in terms of the sort of stability and the mental security that gives a child. That's really interesting. And we don't actually know the reasons. Well, I haven't gone into sort of de facto reasons for that, but that might be interesting to you. Again, gender differences do tend to be real, and they tend to play out in very unexpected ways. And as you said, single dads often tend to have higher levels of income than single moms. That's not to say that that's going to stay. As I said, when those gender gaps fall away, they kind of reappear on the sort of parenting level. But what we definitely do see is the prevalence of older women who have failed to find a romantic partner or decided not to have one at all, trying to later in life, like the Jennifer Aniston case again. She's a great case study just because she's a sort of a stereotype on the sort of trajectory that we're seeing, where these women will try, the ones that stayed single, and secure their eggs, go for either very invasive, very painful, very expensive fertility treatments, and or then look to try and adopt, or to try and get children some other way when they feel that sort of those biological needs kick in a bit later in time. But again, in terms of values and in terms of choices and trade-offs, there's a very big difference to having and raising a child when you're younger and having and raising a child when you are older. And there's a different set of trade-offs for that child too, in terms of what you gain in economic security, you might lose in other sorts of ways of bonding with your parents in an easier sort of generational gap. And there's lots of research that has very, very different sort of outcomes and looks at the pros and cons of all those different things. But that whole sort of almost it's too late and now I want to try and do something is something we see quite a lot. And I think I see it quite a lot in women around my age who are aging into that sort of that zone where your days before you can choose to have a child or not start to become numbered quite quickly, right? So you can kind of see that shift from absolutely don't want to have a family to suddenly, is it going to be too late? And we see this in terms of economic data too, in terms of the company benefits that companies are starting to offer to female employees. Things like, if you work for us, we'll help you freeze your eggs, right? Which is a very strange economic incentive to sort of defer parenthood until later to work with us. But also it sort of really illustrates boldly the actual cost that women are giving up in order to focus on a career rather than focus on a family when they're younger. Anyway.
Yeah. Well, so let me go off my questions list a little bit, because one of the things that kind of occurred to me, and this comes out of my own childhood and growing up, was what I've seen is 25% of children, statistically speaking, come from single family parent households. And so I had two parents growing up. My parents are still married. They just celebrated their 50th. But I had a lot of friends from single family parent households, and they grew up seeing their parents fight, split, litigate, parenting and custody agreements. And this was something that I saw secondhand. So those children growing up, both men and women, is it any surprise that they would want to marry later, or maybe not at all, right? If they grow up with those examples in their life, I guess it wouldn't be a surprise that they would want to stay single and not go through that themselves. So one of the other things that I found in terms of research was currently half of all first marriages, again, in the United States, and then up to 3/4 of second and third marriages currently end in divorce. And to my mind, a lot of this comes out, at least partly, from economic pressures, right? Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, like, marriage is obviously a huge financial commitment. And I think that that's perhaps a problem in our societies in general, in that the whole thing of turning marriage into a legal institution rather than a sort of a personal institution was probably as much a mistake as brands and businesses getting involved in geopolitical affairs, for example, right? Like, there was a reason that we fought so hard for the separation of church and state, right? And marriage right now very much is a legal and economic contract. It is mainly to do with finances in terms of the sort of the legal and the state's intervention in that. Finances, and of course the incentives the state gives you to get married, which can of course make you get married for reasons that perhaps are not the same sort of reasons will get you to stick together with that partner for the long term. But that's a whole different conversation. It is, and it is fair, of course, that married couples have tax benefits compared to unmarried or single people, right? I mean, like, these are very strange, perverse incentives that are put there for perhaps well-intended governance and economic sort of reasons, but have very twisted effects on society at an individual and nuclear level.
Well, Bronwyn, let me thank you so much for your time today. So again, every person, family, and relationship is different. So let me close by asking if you see this trend towards the single lifestyle as a product of individual choice, or is this largely the result of external pressures? Because again, in my view, we want to maximize choice in the hope that individual people make the best choices for themselves and the people they care about.
I think at the moment it is a symptom of social pressure and what we are supposed to want, particularly as women, to kind of correct the wrongs of the past. But I think that going forward, we're going to see, and we already are starting to see with the younger generations now, kind of questioning why and how this is good for me. So on some sides, you could say that's quite a sort of selfish way that we're sort of seeing in this new generation. But other times, other ways to look at it is to say that it's actually quite pragmatic, to say that the choices that work for other people in my own generation might not necessarily work for me. So hopefully we will see more personal value evaluation and people making choices according to what what they need, which might not be what happens to be trending or popular at the moment. We do obviously see pendulums swing, and we probably swung a bit too far when it comes to prioritizing economic independence for women rather than social choice.
Wonderful. Thank you again so much for your time today.
Thank you.